Alright, welcome back to a modest analysis of Gladiator Guild Manager. This video is going to be part 3 of the series, where we look at possible solutions and how I would personally implement some of them. This is also going to be kind of just spitballing of ideas, tossing out some possibly messy code in an effort to kind of show a demonstration of how to fix some of the things that I've suggested. So, to start off with our little example, we just kind of had to make a dummy gladiator class. I have no idea how the game is coded, so I'm just kind of figuring out something that will work for the sake of demonstration. So, for this dummy gladiator class, I assume the gladiators are going to have a class of their own with various stats like level, strength, intelligence, whether or not they're dead, whatever. So for my Ring of Death suggestions, specifically adjusting the challenge to be per gladiator instead of just have the Ring of Death go on cooldown, we would need each gladiator to keep track of whether or not they're available to fight in the Ring of Death, which of course defaulting to true because they haven't fought yet, whether or not they're a participant in the Ring of Death, which would just be used once you lock in your gladiator to kind of wait till the fight ends to decide whether they're dead or just fatigued from the Ring of Death, which naturally would decide whether they're able to be available for missions or quests or championships or what have you. And then just some kind of some integer that tells the system how many days left before the gladiators is available to fight in the Ring of Death again. Then we would need 3 functions for the gladiator, and those 3 would be, well, one function just to tell the gladiator that they are participating in the Ring of Death. Now, this entire Ring of Death participant and Boolean and this function are completely unnecessary if you've already coded the entire dropping gladiators into battle system on its own, and it somehow manages all of that. In which case, you would just need to tell the gladiator at the end of the Ring of Death that they fought in the Ring of Death, which is the next function. So, if they fought in the Ring of Death, so upon conclusion of the battle, which, again, this if statement, the if Ring of Death participant is true, that's completely unnecessary if you have just the gladiators that are in the battle having the function called. But if you just call this on every gladiator, which is the really brute force way of doing it, but it is a way to do it, and you run through every gladiator in the roster to see which ones participated, you can then, for the ones that did participate, set their fatigue to whatever arbitrary value. This is just based on their level. Set them not available to participate in the Ring of Death, and reset the Ring of Death participant to false. So this will prevent the gladiator, as long as you're checking for Ring of Death available true before you let the player drop them in. This will make sure that they have fatigue from the Ring of Death and can't be dropped for however many days. And then, of course, there's some function in the game, I'm sure already, based on the fact that the death recovery has a timer. There's something that already tells the gladiators that a day has passed to reduce the cooldown on when they're available again. So that system could just be improved to also have the Ring of Death fatigue part of it. But if not, if you're, again, just brute forcing it, then you would have each gladiator each day run the day has passed function to check and see if their fatigue is above 0. If it is, reduce it by 1, which is what the minus is. Take the Ring of Death fatigue and look at it, and if it's at 0, then make them once again available for the Ring of Death. And then this actually could also be expanded with a and ring of death available equals false. Oops, not setting it equal to false is false. Which could also be done if exclamation point, so if not ring of death available, then ring of death available equals true. Which, I mean, honestly, it's such a lightweight thing, it doesn't really matter whether you're just going through and setting every gladiator that has a fatigue of 0 to true every day, or if you specifically want to add in that extra check to see if they aren't available and the ring of death fatigue is 0. But either way really works. Go ahead and save that out. So then in this ring of death arena, which again, I don't know how the game's coded, but I can just make this kind of free-form thing. So the Gladiator class, I just kind of skipped over all of my notations because most of them are just saying you can do this any number of ways. But the Ring of Death Arena, we're actually going to go through the comments as well. So I'm not sure what the current system is for the Ring of Death going on cooldown and being unavailable for however many days, but that could easily be tweaked to just, instead of it being unavailable, just to refresh every however many days. So for the function that's being called when the Ring of Death is refreshed, we would want to be able to look at the player roster, which I just tossed together in a tester class. So here is a list of gladiators that the player has called player roster. But I'm sure there's some way, because otherwise the system wouldn't know what gladiators are available to drop into a fight. So there's got to be some system that keeps track of what player or what gladiators the player has. So you just feed that into this function, and it uses that. First it checks to see if the days until refresh are greater than 0. And if they are greater than 0, then it increments by -1. So it counts down until the refresh. And if it is at 0 or below somehow, then resetting the days until refresh until whatever arbitrary amount. And then the parse roster function, we'll look at it in a second, that just looks through the player roster to pull some data out. And then set solo duel enemy level. This could also be done for the 1 versus many or the blind fight enemy levels. So this is just, again, mostly for demonstration purposes. I've included that singular thing, but it could also be used to do everything, which is why it could be even its own class that keeps track of each day that passes, and then has some kind of listener system built in so that everything that's watching how many days countdown just automatically does whatever it's supposed to do after however many days, but that's beyond the scope of this particular discussion. So I've created a few variables that we're going to use mostly to look at the player roster and pull some data out of it. So we need to know the total levels of all the players' gladiators, the number of gladiators they have, the highest level of gladiator they have, and the average level of gladiator they have, as well as the lowest level. Now, the reason the lowest level of gladiator is set to 1,000 by default is because we're going to be looking, and if the gladiator we're looking at has a lower level than the lowest level, then we're going to set the new lowest level. So if the lowest level starts at 0, 0 is always going to be less than the gladiator level, so it'll never change. And since these variables are here outside of the function instead of inside of the function, it means two things. One, we can use those variables between different functions because they're tied to the class rather than the function itself. And two, we have to manually reset them anytime we want those values to not be stored. So then we need a function here to reset them, which just literally sets all of the variables back to the defaults. And now we have this parse roster function. And this is specifically to look through the player roster, check out the levels of all the players' gladiators, and basically populate those variables that we already set. So this could be done when the Ring of Death arena is clicked. It could be done, it needs to be done when the arena is refreshed. Or, again, if it's done when the Ring of Death arena is clicked. And if it is done when the Ring of Death arena is clicked, then that means we could actually only look at the gladiators whose Ring of Death available Boolean is true. So, again, once they fought in the Ring of Death, their Ring of Death available will be false, and they'll have fatigue. So as long as they have fatigue and their availability for the Ring of Death is false, we could actually completely take them out of the calculations, so that the Ring of Death is only populating its enemies based on what gladiators the player has available. But regardless, before we go through the roster, we have to reset the variables to make sure that they have the proper starting values. If you don't do this and you run the parse roster function and then you go back and run it again with a different gladiator roster, if, for example, the lowest level is 1 the first time it's run, and then you go back and run parse roster again and the lowest level gladiators have leveled up, and now they're 2 or 3 or whatever, lowest level won't change. So it is important to reset the variables we're working with every time we parse the roster. It only has to be done when we're parsing the roster, because that's the only point where those values, those variables are being changed. After this, they're just used, not changed. So that's why we reset the variables in this function. So then we just simply loop through the roster, which is the for int I equals 0, I less than player roster dot count I plus plus. That's just a basic for loop. And as we go through each different gladiator, we're going to pull their current level and cache it. Then we're going to add it to the total levels variable. We're going to increment the number of gladiators, because each time we loop through this, we're looking at one gladiator. So we just increase the number of gladiators by 1. We look at the highest level and the cached current level, and if the current level is greater than the highest level becomes the current level. However, if the lowest level is greater than the current level, then the lowest level becomes the current level. So this could also be an else if. It'll do exactly the same thing. And we could put brackets around those things, but if you only have a single line of code with if and for and pretty much all the different loops, C# just knows if there are no brackets that only the next line of code applies. So saves a little bit of room, keeps the number of lines in the file down. But yeah. So after we've gone through every single gladiator in the roster, which again, you could just start all of this with like if player roster I dot is Ring of Death available. So if they are available for Ring of Death, then you can just put all this in brackets. And it will only count the gladiators that are not, currently fatigued. You could also do that for if the gladiators are injured, if the gladiators are recovering from being injured or whatever. It could also be done that way. But for now, we're just going to do it like this. Just count every gladiator, because we're literally just going to brute force create a roster out of just nothing. So the average level then, of course, is the total number of levels divided by how many gladiators there are. So now that we've set that information, we can just access it with the set solo dual enemy level or whatever. So for that, again, this is just an example function. The 1 versus many and blind fight and even the championships could have their levels, the enemy level set in a similar way. So we're going to start with, obviously, the int that we're going to eventually return. We're just going to define it here, set it to 0. So the enemy level starts at 0. And then we are going to set a floor and ceiling for the challenge. So these variables are completely arbitrary and can be tweaked and changed to your liking. It literally just allows you to have a granular control over how the random spread of potential levels happens and how it looks. So I've defined the spread modifier floor as negative 0.5 float, and I've defined the spread modifier ceiling as 0.5 float. So in a little bit, you'll see exactly how that comes in. But basically, if you're on a scale of 0 to 1, with 0 being your minimum gladiator level and 1 being your maximum gladiator level, these would basically be having your subtracting your average or adding your average, something like that. Or I guess it would actually be more like adding or subtracting your median. But regardless, it's just a way to modify the level that's being spit out from the function. But yeah, you can just define whatever formulas you come up with, but this is one way of doing it. So first, we're going to set the maximum challenge level. So the highest possible challenge that a gladiator can be, that an enemy gladiator can be. This is an unnecessary step, but it is a step that can be used. I don't even think I used it in this. Yeah, no, I didn't actually use it in this. This is just an example. So this is an example way of doing it. Set a max enemy level and then just randomly determine between the lowest level gladiator you have and the max enemy level, maybe plus an arbitrary amount. But we're not actually using these, so I can just comment those out. So again, that's just a very quick and simple way of doing it, to randomize the level of enemies instead of just having always the same level based on your progression in the game. And so now we're going to look at a better way of doing it, which is where the spread modifier floor and ceiling variables come into effect. So we start off defining a float of spread adjustment amount. This is going to be starting at 0, which again corresponds to the minimum level of the player's gladiators. And then we're going to look at the difference between the highest and average level in the roster, which is a very verbose name, but it's very hard to get confused what a variable does if you have a very long and verbose name. As long as you don't have to type it out a ton of times, because it can get very tedious typing out so many words. In any case, for this example, we have the difference between highest level and average level, and then we have the difference between average level and lowest level. And since average level is always going to be between highest level and lowest level, we just subtracted it in this way to make sure that both values are a positive number. So now we compare, and if the difference between the highest level and average level in the roster is larger than the difference between the lowest level and average level in the roster. So what this means is the difference between highest and average would be your average level is whatever, and then you have a couple gladiators or a single gladiator that's well above everyone else. That would be when the difference between highest and average is higher than the difference between lowest and average. So in this situation, the 1 versus 1 specifically would be more interesting to be used as like a catch-up mechanic to let the lower level gladiators catch up to that high level gladiator or those high level gladiators. So the spread adjustment amount would actually skew some random point between the spread modifier floor and nothing. So on average, based on the way RNG works, it would reduce the level of enemies in the 1 versus 1. Otherwise, if the difference between lowest and average level is actually larger than the difference between the highest and average, that means that all the gladiators are close to the same level, or at the very least, the majority of the gladiators are close to the same level, at which point we would want there to be, again, a chance of there being enemies that are a good match for our lowest level gladiators, but we would also want there to be a challenge for the average level gladiator. So then we can adjust the spread amount by anything between nothing and the spread modifier ceiling. So in general, on average, increasing the difficulty. So then we get to the actual calculations, and the random roll is just a random number between 0 and 1. So some decimal between 0 and 1. Then we create a weighted result. And what this is going to do is it's going to take into consideration which one of these is true, whether there's a gladiator or two that's well above the average, or if everyone's at or below close to the average. And it's going to either increase the random roll by an amount between 0 and whatever the ceiling is, or decrease the random roll by 0 or whatever the floor is. So you end up with some range between negative whatever the spread modifier floor is. Hold on. That should not be negative. Glad I caught that. So this, by putting a negative sign in front of the spread modifier floor, while the spread modifier floor was already negative, it would have made that a positive. So it would have been doing kind of the same thing as the spread adjustment amount there, or the ceiling. So the floor and ceiling would basically have been doing about the same thing. So glad I caught that. And so, with the random roll then modified by the spread adjustment amount, we're going to get, this is actually old, I actually tweaked it. Oops. I actually tweaked it because I wasn't getting drastic enough results from 0.25 and negative 0.25 and 1.25. So now it's going to be somewhere between negative 0.5 and 1.5 after this random roll. Now obviously, if the difference between the highest and average level gladiator was larger than the difference between the lowest and average level gladiator, then you're going to be looking at this, and you're not going to see negative 0.5 to 1.5. At that point, you're just going to see negative 0.5 to 1. And if the difference between the lowest and average level gladiator, again, if the gladiators are all closer to the same level, then you're going to see between 0 and 1.5 here. And 0 corresponds to the lowest level gladiator in your roster, and 1 corresponds to the highest level gladiator in your roster. So then, we obviously don't want gladiators to be below your lowest level gladiator in the roster, because then there would be absolutely no challenge even for your weakest gladiator. So if the result is equal to or less than 0, we just want it to be the lowest level gladiator in your roster. So if you have level 4 gladiators and everything else you have is above level 4, this will make sure that you never face anything below level 4 in the 1 versus 1, unless you happen to buy another level 1 gladiator or whatever. Then, if it's not below or equal to 0, we check to see if it's at or above 1. And if it is at or above 1, then we put in the highest level gladiator we have, and we multiply it by the weighted result. So this makes it so that, and that is 50, not 25. Because, again, I changed from 0.25 to 0.5. So this means that if we have a gladiator or a couple gladiators well above the rest of our gladiators, we're never going to run into any gladiator higher than the highest level gladiator we have. However, if all of our gladiators are close to average, then we get this result sometimes, which we want to be a challenging fight. Now, multiplying the highest level gladiator by the weighted result means that at minimum, this result will give us a gladiator equal to the highest level gladiator we have. And at maximum, it'll be 50% higher level. So if we have a level 6 gladiator, it would be a level 9 gladiator, which might be impossible for us to beat. So it might be better to have the average level adjusted by the weighted result in some way. Again, keep in mind that this is only going to happen if the average level, like if all the gladiators in the player's roster are close to the average level. Which means having 1.5 times the average level is still likely to be higher than the highest level gladiator the player has. But for now, just for the sake of the demonstration, we're going to make sure it's a really big number. And then, if it's not below 0 or above 1, we're going to use linear interpolation to look between our lowest level gladiator and our highest level gladiator, and we're going to use the weighted result to choose a level somewhere between the two. So if our lowest level gladiator is level 1, and our highest level gladiator is level 10, but we got a result of 0.25, then this is going to be about a level 3 gladiator. Now, I'm not sure if round to int is up or down or just closest, but it's going to round it to a whole number. So the enemy level is always going to be a whole number coming out of this, which is important because you can't have, I'm pretty sure the levels in the game are integers and not floats. So the system would struggle to deal with an enemy level of 2.625 or whatever. So it's important that you take the lerp, which is going to be some kind of float, and you round it to an integer. So now we're going to go to the tester class, which I literally just made to test those changes. So we've got a reference to the Ring of Death Arena, which that is worth noting. I don't think I mentioned that. I made the Ring of Death Arena a mono behavior because I figure there's a physical Ring of Death to click on. And I don't know whether the Gladiator UI elements are part of an actual Gladiator mono behavior, or if there's a raw C# class called Gladiator that is referenced by the UI elements, or if the Gladiators are scriptable objects that, again, are somehow referenced by the UI. The same issue could be true with the Ring of Death. It could be a scriptable object, or just a raw C# class, and the UI could just be completely separate. But just for the sake of this, I just made it a mono behavior so I could slap it on an object, slap the tester on an object as a mono behavior, and run the start function. So obviously, we don't have a player roster. We don't have a player element to this. So I just made a player roster in the tester class, and created a new list of gladiators, and then during the start function, for the two examples I'm about to show, I just manually populated a lot of gladiators. So in the first example, the lowest level is 6, the highest level is 10, and the average level is 8. So in this example, since the difference between the highest level and the average level is 2, and the difference between the lowest level and the average level is 2, that means we're going to go and we're going to be looking at the specific spread amount of 0 spread modifier ceiling. So the result here is going to be anywhere between the level 6 gladiator and a level 15 gladiator, because it's going to be up to 1.5 times the highest level gladiator. So, at the end of creating the roster, I run the parse roster script, which again populates the Ring of Death with the stats it needs, to then run the set solo duel enemy level and kick back a level. So we're going to run that real quick. Well, let it compile. We made a few changes. Okay. So we're running it, and on start, boom. The weighted result was 0.216, and so the level of the enemy gladiator would be 7, which again is a fair challenge for 3 of the gladiators. It's, something worth fighting for 2 of the gladiators, and then 3 of the gladiators overpower it. But if they then use all of their level 10 gladiators, and the next one, for example, is level 10, well, then they have to choose one of their other 2 level 10 gladiators, otherwise their gladiator that they choose is possibly going to get completely destroyed. And finally, another pops up after they finish fighting that one, and it's also level 10. So then they have 1 level 10 left, and they go, okay, well, I'm going to use that one. So then they go back into the Ring of Death Arena, and all of their level 10 gladiators are exhausted, but there's a level 9 gladiator. So then they have to choose, do I fight the level 9 with level 8s or level 6, or do I just wait until the Ring of Death refreshes? And if they do somehow beat the level 9, then boom, there's a level 7, so they can drop in a level 6. And all of the gladiators that come up, you see that even though there's the chance for a level 15 gladiator, it's relatively rare, just because of the way that the system is designed. So I'm just going to quickly pop through this. I should have made a button that lets me just redo this instead of unplaying. But sooner or later, boom. The weighted result was at or above 1, so now it's a level 11 gladiator. Which is still, going to be beatable by a level 10 gladiator. And there's 2 back-to-back. So it randomizes the level of the enemy in such a way that you always have a potential challenge. And if you keep using your high-level gladiators, eventually your high-level gladiators are going to outpace your lower-level gladiators, and so the difference between the highest and average level will become greater than the difference between the lowest and average level. So to demonstrate that, let me just comment this back out, and let me just uncomment this start. So in this example, we have 2 level 1 gladiators, 3 level 2, 1 level 4, and then 2 level 10s. So the lowest level is 1, the highest level is 10, and the average level is 4. So in this example, we don't want a bunch of high-level enemies that the level 10s would just keep fighting and eventually outscale the other gladiators even more. We want it to be more of a catch-up mechanic. That way the lower-level gladiators have a chance of catching up to the level 10 gladiator. Especially if one of the level 1s has a really good quirk that we haven't seen again in the shop, and we really want to get it up there. So, in this situation, once again, we are at the point where the spread modifier floor is in effect. So our result is going to be somewhere between negative 0.5 and 1. Again, negative 0.5 to 0 is going to be the lowest level. In this situation, that's going to be level 1. So anything between negative 0.5 and 0 is going to be a level 1 gladiator. And then if we get 1, then it's still going to be a level 10 gladiator. But that's going to be relatively rare. And it's most likely going to be somewhere in between. So let's just run that a couple times, let it compile. And firing it up, we now see it's a level 3 gladiator, which again, since we have a couple level 2s and a level 4, that can be a challenge to some of our lower level gladiators. And if we drop in a level 10 gladiator, then we only have 1 level 10 gladiator left. And so, the next challenge is a 2. And again, we have to decide, do we want to drop in our level 10 gladiator and risk having a level 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 gladiator that we just can't fight and have to wait for the refresh? Or do we fight it with a lower level gladiator, like one of our level 1s or one of our level 2s? And then if you keep going, the effect of RNG is that you're going to get a lot more, the specific RNG that we implemented. You're going to get a lot more level 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s, and every once in a while, you're going to get a level 10 or a level 9. And this is the point where I kind of wish I hadn't made it negative 0.5. So let's just go and adjust that on the fly real quick. So instead of the floor being negative 0.5, let's make the floor negative 0.2. Which will, again, skew much towards the higher levels, because now, instead of it being a range of negative 0.5 to 1, it's now negative 0.2 to 1. And again, we only get a level 1 gladiator if it's at or below 0. I'm pretty sure if the result's even 0.1 or 0.01, it would still be a level 2 gladiator. Again, not entirely sure how the rounding to integers works, but it's going to be much more rare that we get level 1 gladiators now, and high-level gladiators are going to be more common. So now, with that adjustment, all of a sudden we got a level 5 gladiator, which, again, if we have this spread, we could throw the level 4 in. Or we could spend a level 10, and then only have 1 level 10 left to use. And then, we keep playing in the arena, the Ring of Death, and then there's a level 8. And the only thing we have that can effectively fight a level 8 would be one of our level 10s. But if we already fought 2 of the low level enemies with our level 10 gladiator, then we might have to sit there until the Ring of Death refreshes before we can 1 versus 1 again. Which is really interesting, because that means you can make the refresh be an entire month. Nothing says you have to have it refreshed several times during a month. If a player runs into a challenge that they can't overcome, they might have to wait the 6 days or 8 days or 10 days or however long it is that their highest level gladiator is on cooldown or fatigued for. They might have to wait. So it makes it A, more of a catch-up mechanic for lower level gladiators, and B, it makes it more interesting than just, oh, you've beat the graveyard, all 1 versus 1 opponents are level 3. Oh, you beat the farm, all 1 versus 1 opponents are level 6. And again, if you're doing the same thing for the blind fight and for the 1 versus many, then it makes that Ring of Death much more interesting. Although, do note that you need to have, if you're going to randomize the levels of the blind fight opponents, you need to have some kind of indicator before the player commits to the fight of what level the enemies are, because if they go into the blind fight and they drop in their level 1s and level 2s, and then it turns out the enemies are all level 6, 7, and 8, then they just, that's just bad. Having some kind of indicator, like maybe just a little label that says average level 5 or something, just to give the player some inclination of, okay, I need to be dropping in lower level gladiators for some experience, or higher level gladiators so that my lower levels don't die. But there needs to be some kind of adjustment for that, some kind of warning for the blind fight. So now that that's done, I'm going to move over and create or show the dummy class that I made for items. I only intend to use the item tier and whether or not it's a consumable in the following example. But yeah, I went ahead and made a constructor so I could make items. You'll see in a second I use this. So also back on the gladiator, it's worth noting that if we want to use items, I'm sure there's some way that each gladiator tracks what item it has equipped, or what items it has equipped. And if you're going to want to make gladiators from scratch, like for example enemy gladiators, then you'll need a constructor that's able to take items if you're going to have enemy gladiators being constructed with starting items already in their possession. So, we then move on to this championship arena script, where at first I'm going to go through the equipping enemies with items idea. So you could just literally randomize it. You could make it completely random. You could give the green reward enemies no items, the blue reward enemies 2 items each, or whatever, and then the purple reward items, just all of the items. Just purple reward gladiators are super challenging. They each have 6 items, or whatever. But honestly, extremes or completely random situations like that don't lend themselves to very strategic gameplay and very meaningful choices. Like, if you don't have a bunch of items and the purple reward fight has 6 items on each gladiator, you're never gonna be able to do that. So it's just not a choice. So, again, we're gonna look at what the player has and decide on what items to give to the enemies based on that. So for this, we're going to need to keep track of the number of items the player has equipped. So it's important to know whether they have 1 item on 3 different gladiators, or if they have 6 items on 3 different gladiators. We need to know the total tier of equipment, and for this example, I am going to just use my suggested system of having a tier that's, a weak item and a stronger consumable, and then another tier that's just a slightly stronger item, and then another tier, etc., etc., which actually I can show really quick with this class. I have it right down here. So using something like this, where there's basically 2 tiers per arena you complete, and based on what items you've bought, you have different tier levels of item. So we're going to keep track of the total tier, the highest tier. So if you have a single tier 7 permanent item and you have the rest just tier 1 permanents, then the total equipment tier is actually going to be low compared to the highest equipment tier, as well as the average equipment tier being low compared to the highest equipment tier. So we want to keep track of all those variables. And this is just a way to do it. Just every time we care about equipping enemies with just various gear, we just look at the entire player roster, look at every item on every gladiator. And this is just a sanity check I included because of my slapped together gladiator constructor, where item slots isn't even instantiated unless item slots has items to give it at the start. So just a sanity check there. And if the player, if the gladiator in that particular slot of the player roster has an item, then we want to know how many items they have. So the number of equipped items is increased by the count of the item slots that are full. Because the item slots, since they're a list instead of a... as compared to an array that always has the same length regardless if the slots are full or not, a list is only going to have that count if there are that many items in it. So we can just recklessly increase the number of equipped items by the count of the number of item slots that the gladiator has. Obviously, this would have to be done differently. If we were using an array, we would have to go through each slot of the array and make sure that the value is not null. But with a list, we can just quickly add the count to the number of equipped items. Then we look at each slot, and we, again, cache the item, because if we were doing a lot of stuff in here, we would definitely want a reference to the item, rather than just continuously calling player roster g.item slots I, blah, blah, blah. So then we look at if the item is consumable, and if the item is consumable, then we just ignore it for the purposes of the equipment tier and the highest equipment tier. And this is interesting, because by doing this, if the player has a bunch of items equipped and they're all consumables, it's going to actually lower the average tier of equipment by having consumables instead of permanent items. So it'll actually make the enemies less likely to have equipment if you're just using nothing but consumables. Which is important because, I mean, again, consumables in their current iteration are very weak. This would actually make them quite strong, because it would give you the ability to have temporary power that the system does not take into consideration when designating your enemies. Which means using consumables would make the purple challenges much easier than just bringing permanent items to the fight. But again, this could be done very differently. But so for this iteration, I have it just ignoring. If it's not consumable, it takes it into consideration for the highest equipment tier and the total equipment tier. If it is consumable, it just adds it to the number of items and ignores the rest. So now that once we've run through every item on every gladiator, then we could just immediately give enemies items and, just hope that everything's fine and hope that the player's not abusing the system at all. Or we can check the player's inventory to see if they've just unequipped all of their items before going into the championship in an effort to cheese the system. So we're going to do that. We're going to look at the player's inventory, which is, all the items off to the side of the screen that aren't equipped on any gladiator. And again, we're going to look at the number of items, the total tier of the items, and the average tier of the items. So we're going to do literally the exact same thing that we did with the gladiators. We're going to look through the entire inventory, one item at a time. We're going to count the number of items, as long as it's not... this should actually be num player items ++. Well, then again, no, because for the player inventory... Yeah, no, we definitely would want to keep it consistent. So we would want the increment of the player items to be just for every item in the inventory. So if there's a bunch of consumables, it'll lower the average. Then again, if they're not using the consumables... Yeah, no, we actually do want to count... Oops, what did I do? Where did I go? Redo. Okay, that was just delete. Cool. So if they're just sitting on a lot of consumables, we don't want the unused consumables to count for the number of items for the average. We only want to look at the permanent items that the player does not have equipped, because those are the ones that we're worried about the player tossing over into their inventory, going into the battle to generate the enemies, and then putting the permanent items back on the player, or back on the gladiators. Again, if they're using the consumables, we're happy. We want the consumables to be useful. So this, again, is buffing consumables, making consumables stronger. They don't even count towards the average, the tier average for the items in the player's inventory. So then we're going to increase the total number of player items by each tier, or the total tier of player items by each item's tier. And then, if it's higher than the highest equipment tier, for example, if they just put a bunch of really low-level equipment or consumables on the gladiators and put all of their high-level equipment off into their inventory, trying to trick the system into thinking, oh yeah, they have very little equipment, then this is going to catch that. So, after we basically keep track, or once we make note of the total tier and the highest tier of all of the items in the player's inventory, we can average it out, so total player items tier divided by number of items, and then we can check and see if they're trying to cheese the system. So if the average player item tier is larger than the average equipment tier, which is, again, the equipment that's actually on the gladiators, then the average equipment tier is going to become the average player item tier, because haha, we caught you. Now, this obviously needs to be a lot more polished before it's finished, and before it's going to, catch all the abuse cases and not mess up players who have a bunch of intelligence-based items in their inventory, but have a bunch of, strength and agility-based gladiators. There's a lot of different, individual situations where this would not work and where it would need to be modified and fixed. But for the sake of being simple, down and dirty, there we go. So that is a quick check on the player trying to abuse the system. So now that we have an average equipment tier and a highest equipment tier, which, again, we're just up here, when we're checking the item tier, the highest equipment tier in the player's inventory, this would need to be adjusted to possibly look at what stats are being used by the gladiators and what stats on the equipment or whatever. But right now, we're just literally, if there's a higher tier piece of equipment that's not consumable in the player's inventory, that's not, for whatever reason, equipped on the player's gladiators, it's still going to be considered in this equation, or in this system. So, we have all of our information. We now need to develop a pool of items to give to the enemy gladiators. So, we're going to jump down to this function right here, because it's very brute force, it can be done a lot of ways, and I just made a way to do it. So it's returns a list of items, which is going to literally be the items we put on the enemy gladiators. And we take in whatever difficulty the fight is, however many enemy gladiators there are, whatever the average tier of player items and the highest tier of player items are. We create a new list to return. We set the lowest tier of item we're going to generate to 0. The max number of items is always going to be however many gladiators there are times 6, because otherwise we would end up with gladiators that can't accept the items that are left, and that would break our system, causing some kind of bug. And so then we need an integer for the number of items, which is going to be calculated, and you could, again, go in and take a lot of things into consideration and then linearly interpolate between two different values, and I just, for brevity's sake, since I already went over the long way of doing stuff, this is just going to be a random number between 0 and the max number of items. And so again, you know, it's very hacky, but it works. Just, you know, if you're building an actual game, do something more in depth than this unless you're just prototyping. If you're prototyping, this is fine. If you're trying to get a released product, please do something more complex than just a roll of the dice to see how screwed the player is. So then we're going to look at the difficulty and we're going to adjust. And I did this based on the concept of the green reward, blue reward, and purple reward fights. You could actually have many more settings of difficulty. Like you could have the green rewards be anywhere between a 1 and 3 difficulty, and the blue reward be anywhere between 4 and 6, and the purple reward be anywhere 7 plus or whatever. Like you could really tweak this system and get really nitty gritty and modify it so many different ways. But for this, again, going for a simple example, the lowest tier of item that's going to be generated is equal to whatever the highest tier of player item is minus 6. Although I actually need to include the caveat that if lowest tier is less than 0, lowest tier equals 0. And I need to do that for all of them, because otherwise that's a potential bug that could pop up and ruin everything. Just manually making sure that the error is prevented. And likewise, we could do it the smarter way and just do it after the switch. Which, yeah, I'm an idiot. Let's just do that instead. So, after the switch, then we just go, if lowest tier is less than 0, lowest tier equals 0. And obviously, tier 0 items probably wouldn't exist. So then we would have to actually split this off. So if lowest tier is less than 1, let's just make it a level 1 item. Okay, that fixes that issue. So, moving on, we have a number of items that we've determined up here by this random picking between 0 and 6 items per gladiator. And for each of those items, we need to figure out what type of item it is. And this is where we would put in whatever type of item it is, which, if you wanted to do it well, you would have to look at the type of gladiator it's being put on to make sure that it's not a completely useless item. And then we would add to the list of equipment that we're returning a new item. And again, this is just a down and dirty way of doing it. We could just add a variety of random items and then return the list and then look at the list at a later time to determine what gladiator it goes on, or we could do that here. There's a lot of ways to do it. In any case, for this, we're just going to create a new item with a tier somewhere between the random range. You can see here, we're creating an item, so we're using the constructor that looks for an item tier and whether or not it's consumable. And optionally, you could have consumable items be added to the gladiator. I just put false here for the sake of it. But you go anywhere between the lowest tier that you've calculated and the highest tier you've calculated. You could do this very fancy and have a good spread, or, you know, make it a high-end spread, low-end spread, whatever. You can do a lot of fancy things other than just picking a random number, but I'm just trying to give a quick example of this item change. So then we return the list and we go back to where we did that. So here we created a list of enemy items, and so that returned a list of items. So then we're going to create an integer to keep a tally of how many items we've handed out, and we're going to create a while loop. And it's very important for any novices that are watching this, for anyone who's trying to develop a passion side project or whatever. Be very careful with while loops. It's very easy to crash your game by making a while loop just never break and never stop. Now, they're cool because if you do them right, they simplify a lot of things into a single line of code, or basically a single line of code. So, what we're doing here is we're cycling through the enemies, cycling through the gladiators that we're facing, or that the player's facing, and just giving them each an item. And again, the best way to do this would be to actually look at the type of gladiator, look at the items available, decide which item goes to which gladiator, and that's a very complex way of doing it that I would have had to spend much more time on. And maybe in a future A-modest analysis, part 3, I will do some fancier, crazier, more in-depth stuff like that. But for now, I'm trying to get the point across and show that it's not super complicated to do these things, at least to get them working marginally and then improve on them from there. So we're literally just giving each enemy one item and increasing the number of items we've handed out, which is all this is. It's just counting how many we've handed out. And then the while loop breaks once the enemy item counter, so how many we've handed out, equals the number of items that we generated, essentially. So, at that point, we break out of it, and all the enemies have items. Or at least, all the enemies have items if that random number was higher than 0. Or, well, okay, so if that random number was equal to or higher than the number of gladiators. Otherwise, there might just not be any items, or there might be a single gladiator with an item. So, regardless, yeah, that's a way to do it. So now, I think, for the freeform bit, I don't know exactly how I want to do this, so I'm just going to kick something around, because I have absolutely no idea how the developers have created their gladiators, have created their championships, have the, conclusion of championships programmed, or whatever. So I'm just going to guess that there is some function that ends the battle. Oops. There we go. Alright, so I don't know, it could return bool. I mean, it could just be a coroutine that runs while the battle's going to watch and see once all the gladiators on one side or the other are dead. I don't know, but somehow, some way, the game is notified that one team or the other has been defeated. So, we are going to, if the player has defeated the enemy gladiators, we're going to call another function called something along the lines of proceed to next battle. And so we need to create that. Public void proceed to next battle. Okay. Oh, right. That needs to actually have stuff in it. Or just be an empty player then picks new battle and keeps fighting. And that's kind of where it seems like Gladiator Guild Manager's battle ends. You either proceed to the next battle, or you break out and go back to the main screen. Or, no, actually, proceed to reward screen is what they really do. Which, of course, we'll need to create that to get rid of the red squiggly. So, player gets rewards earned and goes back to world map. Okay, so right now, those are basically the only two results at the end of a championship battle. So all we would have to do is, instead of just looking and saying, so I'm not going to try to use actual if statements, because then the system will just have a bunch of red squigglies, because I'm going to have to use variables that don't exist in the context of my little proxy thing. So if the player has been defeated by the enemy gladiators. So actually there would also be a function, so kill gladiators that lost. Yeah. Makes gladiators unavailable for future battles. Okay, so right now they have it so that if you defeat the enemy gladiators, any gladiator you have that fell in combat is unavailable for the rest of the tournament, but you still get to proceed to the next battle. And if all of your gladiators in that particular fight fall, you immediately jump to the reward screen. So, instead of if the player has been defeated, we are going to change this to if the player surrenders or finishes final battle only. Okay? So we've changed the proceeding to the reward screen where you open your rewards and check out what's going on to only happen if you choose to surrender or if you go to the final battle and win. Those are the only two situations where you go straight to the reward screen. Otherwise, we still want to kill the gladiators that lost. So, regardless of win or lose, any gladiator that fell in battle is dead. Boom. So we separate these two out. And now, we check to see if the enemy gladiators were still alive. Okay? If not, we proceed to next battle as usual. However, if the enemy gladiators won, there will be at least one left alive. So, in this situation, we will allow the player to drop gladiators into the same exact battleground without removing the enemies or in any way interrupting the regular course of battle. So we would just return. We would have a function called return to gladiator selection phase. Whatever the current code is for the game. Yeah, you see exactly why super verbose things can get very whatever. This kicks the player back to the point where they are dropping in their gladiators. It is up to how things are coded and what the developer feels like doing if the option to back out and choose one of the other challenges is still available, or if the player is locked into the opponents that beat them. Also worth noting, depending on how it is coded, you could just leave whichever enemy gladiators didn't die as opponents, and allow the player to potentially drop in a weaker team to finish them off. So, by breaking it up like this, and again, I didn't actually program in because that would take a lot of various variables and booleans to compare, if this, then that. And it doesn't really matter because I have no idea how it's currently implemented. And this changes based on how it's currently implemented. So again, we're splitting up whatever system it is that kills the gladiators whenever they fall in combat from whatever lets them proceed to the next battle. And I'm pretty sure the killing the gladiators also applies whenever you lose. And normally you would proceed to the reward screen, but I'm explicitly saying that needs to be a separate thing. So when a gladiator falls, they are dead, whether it be permadeath or not, they are dead. And then, if the enemies all died, you proceed to the next battle as normal. But if there's any enemy gladiators left, or you could even check to see if all the players' gladiators died, then instead of immediately going to the reward screen, you just go back to the point in the system, to whatever phase it is, or whatever state that you have in your state machine that lets the player drop gladiators in. And as long as all the gladiators that they've lost are still dead, that potentially forces them to surrender. Because then at that point, they have to decide, do I have the teams I need? Do I have the number of gladiators I need? The strength of gladiators I need to keep going in this arena? And so that gives so much more depth to the actual championships themselves, instead of just, you lost one battle, time to wait another month to try again. As I said in part 2, there's no story there. It's just, I lost, okay, I gotta wait another month before I can try again. Instead of that story, that heroic story of, I pulled out my bottom rung benchwarmer gladiators and they miraculously finished off the enemies to win the championship. Or the tragedy of, my primary team died, and then I thought my secondary team could handle it, and they all died. And then I dropped in the last 2 gladiators I had against the one last enemy, hoping they could pull out the victory, and they failed. Especially if permadeath is enabled. This would make permadeath so much more crazy deep than it currently is, with just this one change. So, especially, again, if the system is built so that you only have to finish off whoever's left standing after they kill your entire team, because then there's that permadeath risk reward of, do I risk my lower level gladiators? Do I risk my weaker gladiators to go after this dude, this one last enemy standing, and maybe kill him for one more purple reward or whatever? Or do I just back off, cut my losses, and call it quits? So, alright, so just checked. It has now been an hour plus that I've been recording, so I think that covers most of it. Again, I gave some solutions, at least simple versions of those solutions. And some of them, literally, there's nothing, I don't know how the system works. So I have no idea how they have the blind fight unlocked and the solo duel not unlocked until the graveyard. But swapping those, that should be super easy. I can't really give an example of that because I don't know what systems we're working with. I'd have to build an entire an entire setting, an entire game to be able to show how to switch that lever on and that lever off or whatever. So that's just something that, if you know how to do it, you know how to do it. If you don't know how to do it, it's not hard. Let me just go and give you the quick and dirty example. So, you say you have class, I already have class Ring of Death Arena. Okay, so, Ring of Death Arena. Up here, you're gonna have Bull. solo duel unlocked equals false. Fool. Blind fight a battle unlocked equals true. And then you literally just go, okay, that is now false, and that is now true. And then you go into the code of whatever that unlocks it when the Graveyard Championship is defeated, and you just change it from saying solo duel unlocked equals true to saying blind fight battle unlocked equals true. So, like, again, it's very simple. I don't know how it's implemented exactly, so I can't say what all steps would be needed. Also, I didn't touch on in this, but if you do go with having the Gladiator cooldown instead of the global cooldown for the Ring of Death, you can actually drop the reward value considerably. If you expect the player to be fighting in the Ring of Death for, 10, 12, 15 times per month, then instead of giving 25 gold each time, you could just give 5. And that would balance out the reward of, okay, so yeah, they're fighting in the Ring of Death a lot more frequently, but the only reward we really want them to get from that is experience. Possibly consumables, possibly whatever, The rewards would have to be adjusted for that change, but it wouldn't be difficult to do, especially if following previous advice and inflating the economy so that there's more granularity between, good quirk gladiators, bad quirk gladiators, good items, bad items, consumable items, whatever. Just having that granularity of, yeah, you go and you fight in the Ring of Death arena, you get 25 gold per battle, but you need 1,000 to hire a gladiator. Like, that level of granularity would allow you to go, okay, well that's too much. So let's bump the reward for the Ring of Death up to 50 gold. Or, okay, buying a gladiator costs 500 gold, and giving 25 gold at per battle is too much, so let's lower that down to 10 or 5 or whatever. And you could even go as far as to tie the reward for whatever Ring of Death they're doing to the level and challenge of the enemies they're facing. So, like, there's no reason a level 1 versus 1 gladiator could not just give you 5 gold. Because, if you're fighting a level 1, it's going to be easy even if you have a level 1 gladiator. So why should you get gold reward? You're mostly there for the experience. But if you beat a level 10 or 12 or 15 gladiator in a 1 versus 1, you should get some reward other than just the experience. So that would have to be adjusted, but it's whatever. And then I showed how to randomize the challenge of the Arena of Death enemies. I showed how to have the current cooldown of the Arena of Death change into a refresh. And yeah, allowing teams to fight after other teams have fallen. That is a huge improvement, in my opinion, to the core loop of the game. It makes the core loop more compelling. And I feel like that would really strengthen the game. That one simple change. Just letting you continue fighting even after you lose your best guys. And then, yeah, adjust the economy. I can't really, I could theorize all sorts of adjustments for the economy, but I gave a few examples in part 2. Scaling system, that's, again, something I went over here in pretty good detail. And the consumables I touched on. Item variety, again, went over in part 2. So that literally covers all of my suggestions. Yeah, if you have any other suggestions of what you think would be cool changes or whatnot, feel free to toss them in the comments. If you have any questions about any of the horrible, messy, thrown together code that I showed, feel free, drop a comment, and I will absolutely do my best to assist or help or maybe even learn from you guys. If you go, oh, that's a terrible way to do it, here's a much better way, I could very easily learn some cool stuff from you guys. So that has been a modest analysis of Gladiator Guild Manager Part 3. So, thanks for stopping by. I hope you learned something cool, and until next time, have a good one.